Following the court's removal of religious principles, pregnancies for girls ages 10 through 14 shot up by 460%. America now has the highest teen pregnancy rate of any nation in the industrialized world. Sexually transmitted diseases among students also reached previously unrecorded highs. Notice how low the rates had been. Notice the point where religious principles were removed, and look at the dramatic increase that followed. Strikingly, moral measurements for students broke violently in the wrong direction following the court's 1962-63 policy of enforced secularism. This is a strong correlation. Perhaps it's merely coincidental, but it certainly is clear and striking. Consider the next category in which public policy long maintained the use of biblical principles, the category of our parents, that is, our families. What happened with the exclusion of biblical principles? Consider the area of marital stability. According to federal statistics, the divorce rate had been steadily declining for years and even decades prior to 1962-63. But then notice what happened. Religious principles were excluded from public policy and the divorce rate skyrocketed. Suddenly, the United States found itself #1 in the world in the divorce rate. Similarly, the number of single-parent families also exploded, reaching almost triple its previous level, and unmarried couples living together increased tenfold, soaring by over 1,000%. In fact, having now excluded biblical principles, some American policymakers even became confused about how to define something as simple as marriage. Was it to remain the union of a man and a woman? Or should it become that of a man and a man? Or a woman and a woman? Or 5 men and a woman, or vice versa? Or is it perhaps an older man and an adolescent girl? Or any of the other possible combinations? What remarkable changes have occurred since biblical values were excluded from public policies on the family. The third category over which God's assistance had been petitioned in that unconstitutional prayer was our teachers, that is, our schools. What happened when God and biblical principles were barred from our schools? One excellent indicator is the SAT test, the Scholastic Aptitude Test, an academic test for college-bound high school students that has been used in America since 1926. Prior to 1962-63, SAT scores bounced around the same general level and had been stable for decades. But following the removal of God from education, scores plummeted year after year after year after year. Other school-related statistics showed similar adverse changes. Consider finally the fourth category, that of our country, or the nation. Just from a common sense perspective, what do you think will happen when a policy is adopted that says, you can't see the 10 Commandments, things like don't steal and don't kill? You might obey them. We can't have that. Logic dictates that to exclude such principles and values will affect behavior. Apparently it did. In fact, George Washington, in yet another remarkable insight from his excellent farewell address, accurately predicted what has now occurred.
Let it simply be asked, where is the security for property, for reputation, for life, if the sense of religious obligation desert?
Washington warned that if the sense of religious obligation were separated from the public arena, that there would be no security for life or property, the very things most often touched by violent crime. In America, violent crime had remained stable for decades, but following the removal of religious principles, violent crime soared over 470%, with the United States becoming the world's leader in crimes committed. There are many additional examples of marked changes in national statistical measurements following 1962-63. Significantly, the founders understood that America could prosper only under God's blessings and therefore refused to separate His principles from any aspect of public affairs. In fact, concerning God's blessings, Benjamin Franklin, right here in Independence Hall, reminded political leaders in his day,
without his concurring aid, we ourselves shall become a reproach and a byword down to future ages.
But the founders understood that in order for God to bestow His blessings, His principles first had to be honored and embraced. George Washington pointed out,
the propitious smiles of heaven can never be expected on a nation that disregards the eternal rules of order and right, which heaven itself has ordained.
In fact, The thought of disregarding what Washington had called God's eternal rules of order and right was a fearful thought for the Founding Fathers. As Thomas Jefferson acknowledged,
I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever.
of course, the Founders' reasoning that God will bless or oppose a nation based on the policies it adopts makes sense only if there is a God, only if He has established transcendent rights and wrongs, and only if He responds to a nation on that basis. But if these ifs are true, then it goes a long way toward explaining the correlation so visible on the charts. Obviously, the Founders certainly believed these ifs to be true, and they therefore repeatedly stressed that God should be openly and publicly acknowledged throughout the civic arena. For example, consider this document. This is the very first federal Thanksgiving proclamation, a proclamation written by President George Washington. In this document, Washington forcefully reminded Americans,
It is the duty of all nations to acknowledge the providence of Almighty God, to obey His will, to be grateful for His benefits, and humbly to implore His protection and favor.
this is exactly what America did prior to 1962-63. Samuel Adams made a similar declaration.
May every citizen in the country have a proper sense of the deity upon his mind, and an impression of the declaration recorded in the Bible, Him that honoreth me, I will honor, but he that despiseth me shall be lightly esteemed. 1 Samuel 2:30.
America long guided its public policy with a clear awareness of these principles, fully embracing the belief that when America honored God, God could bless America, but that if America adopted policies that despised God and His standards, His blessings should no longer be expected. This belief stemmed from the principle of national accountability to God. While this concept is not completely unknown today, it's the concept of individual accountability to God that's still widely accepted. Most people believe that someday they will stand before God and answer to Him for their behavior. However, the Founders stressed both individual and national accountability, and they also understood a fundamental difference between the two, the difference of when that accountability would occur. They recognized that individuals would answer to God in the future, but that nations would not. That when a nation passed from existence, it was forever gone and would not be resurrected to answer for what it had done. So when does a nation answer to God? That question was answered right here in this room on the floor of the Constitutional Convention in 1787 when George Mason, known as the father of the Bill of Rights, reminded the other delegates,
As nations cannot be rewarded or punished in the next world, they must be in this. By an inevitable chain of causes and effects, Providence punishes national sins by national calamities.
Other founders echoed the same truth. They believed that God would deal with the nation right now, in the present, for the stands that it takes and the policies it enacts. Understanding the profound consequences of national accountability, the Founders were emphatic about keeping in public office those who would enact policies that God could bless. But leaders who honor God's principles are placed into office only when voters themselves first embrace those principles and then apply them as a standard to guide their vote. Therefore, if God-fearing citizens are not involved at the ballot box, then God-fearing leaders will not be elected to office, God-honoring policies will not be enacted, and the result is that the respective city or state or nation will not be blessed by God. This is why Chief Justice John Jay had reminded the voters in his day,
Providence has given to our people the choice of their rulers, and it is the duty as well as the privilege and interest of our Christian nation to select and prefer Christians for their rulers.
In the same vein, the Reverend Charles Finney reminded Christian voters in his day,
The time has come that Christians must vote for honest men and take consistent ground in politics. Christians have been exceedingly guilty in this manner, but the time has come when they must act differently. Christians seem to act as if they think God does not see what they do in politics, but I tell you, He does see it, and He will bless or curse this nation according to the course Christians take in politics.
Of course, news reporting today rarely mentions whether a candidate running for office embraces or rejects God-fearing and biblical principles. And God-fearing citizens often complain that they don't know what a candidate really believes. Well, thankfully, there are now a number of voter websites available to help identify the specific beliefs of candidates on numbers of important issues, including those related to biblical values. Links to several such websites are available at www.wallbuilders.com. In addition, when a race has a state or a federal incumbent running for re-election, numerous websites will present the incumbent's voting record, clearly establishing what he's actually done while in office. And by the way, a voting record is always to be believed above a candidate's speeches or campaign ads, for as the old axiom correctly states, actions speak louder than words. God-fearing citizens must become active voters. They must also realize that separation of church and state, as it exists today, is not a teaching of the Founding Fathers. It is not an historical teaching, and it's not a teaching of law until recent years. While we fully support a separation between the two institutions of church and state, that does not mean a separation of values and principles and religious expressions from the public square. Furthermore, because of contemporary court rulings, we need to recognize that there is going to be someone's religion in the schools and in the government. With the courts having rejected traditional meanings, it's led to a number of absurd consequences. For generations, the understanding of what constituted a religion was simple and straightforward. By all definitions, to be a religion required a belief in some supreme being who set forth commands by which he expected his followers to live and conduct their affairs. That is, religion required a belief in the existence of some supreme being who was to be worshiped and obeyed by his followers. Consequently, the term religion could include those of the pagans, or Muslims, or Jews, or Hindus, or Christians, or many others. However, groups that did not acknowledge some type of supreme being were never considered to be religions. But in the early 1960s, when the court decided to change the long-standing meaning of the First Amendment, it also decided to change the long-standing meaning of religion. And just as it wrote its own new First Amendment, it also wrote its own new definition for religion. Under its new definition, a person's religion was whatever he believed so strongly that it affected the way he behaved. As a result, many beliefs and creeds and philosophies that completely denied the existence of any supreme being suddenly became legal religions. Consider a few absurd examples from the many that now exist. Courts now hold that atheism is a religion. But atheism is the essence of anti-religion, so how can anti-religion be a religion? What are the religious beliefs of atheists? Well, atheists believe devoutly that there should be no public religious expressions. So the religion of atheism is the religion of practicing no religious practice. That is, it is religiously practicing non-religion. And the courts now officially consider atheism to be a First Amendment religion entitled to full religious protections. Don't shake your head to clear it just yet. Courts and government officials have also ruled that satanic and Wiccan groups are now religious groups, and that people who give contributions to those groups may receive the same tax deductions as people who give contributions to Christian churches or Jewish synagogues. The courts also consider secular humanism to be a legitimate religion, equivalent under the law to Christianity. But what is the primary belief of the religion of secular humanism? It's the belief that everything revolves around man rather than God. It's a man-centered philosophy that excludes God. There is no belief in any kind of supreme being, yet this is a court-recognized religion. Scientology, begun in the 1950s, is also now an official religion. Its beliefs are simple. It says,
In Scientology, no one is asked to accept anything as belief or on faith. That which is true for you is what you have observed to be true.
The truth in this religion is whatever an individual personally picks and chooses to be true. Scientology is often described as a self-help philosophy. And even though there are dozens of other self-help philosophies and groups across the nation, this one calls itself a religion and thus secures additional court protections. And as a final example, Universalist Unitarianism, formed in 1961, is now recognized as a legal religion. Interestingly, this may be the most comprehensive religion in the world, for it has absolutely no fixed set of beliefs or doctrines. As it explains,
We believe that personal experience, conscience, and reason should be the final authorities in religion, and that in the end, religious authority lies not in a book or person or institution, but in ourselves. We are a non-creedal religion. We do not ask anyone to subscribe to a creed.
Because the primary doctrine of this religion is that every individual may choose whatever he wants to believe, followers of this religion often hold diametrically opposite beliefs on the same issue. Nevertheless, both opposite beliefs are included as part of the official beliefs of this legal religion. Clearly, every individual in America, or for that matter, in the world, could qualify to be part of this religion, for all have individual beliefs that stem from their own personal experience. Previously, the beliefs of all of these types of groups were protected by the First Amendment's Free Speech Clause, as well as its Assembly Clause, that is, the right of persons to assemble together. But these groups were not protected by the Constitution's religion clauses. Those clauses existed to protect the truly religious. But now, the constitutional protections for the truly religious have been expanded to include every individual, even the non- and the anti-religious, thereby eradicating the religious protections for the truly religious. Okay, so all of these beliefs and many others are now officially considered religions. That is, Christianity is a religion, as is secularism, atheism, universalism, Scientology, Satanism, and so on. They're all religions, but when is it that the cry of separation from church and state is heard? Are all these religions treated the same? Do social activists enter public schools at Halloween and demand, "Get those witches down off the walls. Witchcraft is a legal, organized religion recognized by the courts. I demand separation of church and state"? Or do they enter schools, look around, and then say, "I don't see any prayer here. I don't see any Bible reading here. As a matter of fact, I don't see any religious practice here"? That means the religion of atheism is being practiced here. The religion of secularism is established here. I demand separation of church and state. Get the religions of atheism and secular humanism out of the schools. Such demands are unknown. So when do we hear separation of church and state? We hear it any time that there's an attempt to involve Judeo-Christian but not other religious principles. That is, not at Halloween, but rather at Thanksgiving and Easter and Christmas. Clearly, there's a double standard. Today's separation of church and state only means that biblical principles must be kept out of public, but not the principles, beliefs, or practices of other religions, or even the so-called religions. Perhaps the clearest demonstration of this fact is evidenced by the United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit, which has jurisdiction over 7 states and 54 million Americans. That federal court ruled that it was not constitutional for public school students to say, "Under God" in the Pledge of Allegiance, but that it was constitutional for public schools to require a 3-week indoctrination to the Islamic faith in which junior high students must pretend that they're Muslims and they must offer prayers to Allah. Additionally, they're urged to take Islamic names, call each other by those names, wear Islamic garb, participate in jihad games, and read the Quran during those 3 weeks. Significantly, that federal court of appeals did not think that requiring Islamic religious activities violated the so-called separation of church and state, but they believed that voluntarily saying "Under God" in the Pledge of Allegiance did. Courts have also held that classroom libraries may include books on Eastern Oriental religions and Native American religions, but that they must remove books about Christianity. Islamic symbols may be publicly displayed at schools during Islamic holidays, but Christian symbols may not be displayed during Christian holidays. And schools may accommodate the distinct religious dress and clothing preferences of Muslim students, but not of Christian students. Because the courts now define religion to be whatever a person believes so strongly that it affects the way he behaves, the result is that there will never be a time when someone's religious beliefs will not be part of public policy. Therefore, the proper question is no longer whether religious beliefs will be part of public policy, but rather whose religious beliefs will be part of that policy. Will it be the religious beliefs of atheism, secularism, Islam, Eastern mysticism, universalism, self-help Scientology, or a plethora of other religions, creeds, and beliefs? Or will it be the Judeo-Christian religious beliefs upon which the nation was founded and which over 85% of Americans still embrace today? In short, separation of church and state as it exists today is not a teaching of the Founding Fathers or even a historical teaching, but it is the war cry of the modern secularist and anti-biblicist. In America, we've lost much ground in recent years as we've lost our understanding of our own history. We do have a godly heritage in America, but we've been robbed. Robbed by the 3%, by the secularists, and by what is often an all too willing group of public officials and judges who work to establish secularism across the nation. Significantly, however, there are many excellent, God-fearing public officials and judges at all levels of government who do respect and who do work to protect our history and traditional values. But we as voters have become negligent in recent years, and by our own complacency and our own lack of investigation into the beliefs of candidates, we've allowed into public office too many who hold the opposite view. It's time that Americans relearn their own history and refamiliarize themselves with their own governing documents. As Chief Justice John Jay recommended,
Every member of the state ought diligently to read and to study the Constitution of his country. By knowing their rights, they will sooner perceive when they are violated and be the better prepared to defend and assert them.
it is also time for Americans to become re-engaged in the civil arena. As John Adams admonished,
We electors have an important constitutional power placed in our hands. It becomes necessary to every citizen, then, to be in some degree a statesman and to examine and judge for himself the political principles and measures. Let us examine them with a sober Christian spirit.
in short, it's time for Americans to recover the things we've given up in recent years. It's time to get involved.
Through Wall Builders, you'll experience more of America's forgotten history and heroes. You'll discover again our great moral, religious, and constitutional heritage through award-winning DVDs, tapes, CDs, books, and other exciting materials. Setting the Record Straight reintroduces this generation to the forgotten heroes and untold stories from our rich African-American political history. There's Joseph Hayne Rainey, the first African-American elected to the U.S. Congress. Reverend Frederick Douglass, first African-American appointed to office in 4 presidential administrations. Reverend Hiram Rhodes Revels, the first black U.S. senator, and many others. Filled with exciting reenactments and dramatic events, Setting the Record Straight is an inspiring look at the values and courageous contributions of African-American leaders to our nation's heritage. For 4 centuries, 3 essential elements formed the core of American education: religion, morality, and knowledge. In recent decades, American schooling has turned secular with disastrous results. In David Barton's 4 Centuries of American Education, you'll see the evidence for America's educational decline. You'll also see the leading educators and textbooks of the past that once made America a world leader in education. This video will challenge and inspire us to